In the Stellar Council chamber, the vote passed before Annika Rasmussen finished her coffee. That detail would appear in the documentary records 17 months later, flagged by a junior archivist who had been assigned to cross-reference the session timestamps. The archivist noted it without comment, the way one notes a cloud formation before understanding it is a storm. The vote had been 71-4. The neutrality resolution was binding, and the delegate from Earth had been watching the surface of her drink. V. L. Haridas of the THR of Unnearich filed the session summary within 40 minutes of adjournment, under the heading Human Delegate Behavioral Assessment. The entry read: subject displayed no verbal protest, no formal objection procedure, no request for procedural review, stillness consistent with capitulation behavior observed in species-level resignation events, recommend accelerated annexation timeline for Saul Plateau colonies, resistance probability low to negligible. The summary was correct in every fact it recorded. It was wrong about all of them. The chamber itself had been running 2 degrees warmer than regulation for the entire session. Annika had noticed it when she arrived. The environmental panel on her secondary screen showed a vent calibration lag, something in the intake sensor network reading ambient correctly but compensating incorrectly. She had opened the correction interface, typed the 4-character adjustment code, and tabbed to the next intake record. It had taken 11 seconds. Then the presiding officer had called the chamber to order, and she had wrapped both hands around her cup, and the session had begun. 71 delegations voted in favor of the neutrality resolution. For voted against, the 4 were the delegation of the Quola Ari Continuance, the MEV Hari Compact, the Set His Borderlands Coalition, and a minor systems block that did not have a formal name in the Stellar Council's filing architecture, only a registration number, because it had never been large enough to matter. Annika looked at the 4 names on the tally board for exactly as long as it took her to lift the cup and drink. Then she set it down, tapped the rim once with 2 fingers, and opened the intake record she had been reviewing before the session started. The part they never entered into the record, which she said to Quo Ari Radiate Mill after the chamber cleared, that comes later. 9 years earlier, Annika had been a mid-rank diplomatic cartographer attached to the Earth Coordinated Office, assigned to map the voting relationships inside the Stellar Council's minor species block. The assignment had been considered administrative in nature. Nobody mapped minor species voting relationships for strategic purposes. The minor species did not have the population mass, the resource weight, or the political cohesion to constitute a strategic bloc. They were, in the language of the Council's own internal assessments, fractional actors. The abstention log was her idea. Every session, across 9 years, she recorded every minor species delegation that voted present instead of yes or no. Present meant we are here, we are watching, we have not committed. In the Council's parliamentary structure, a present vote carried no procedural weight whatsoever. It was the least powerful option available. Most analysts ignored it entirely. The Council's own vote-counting software filtered present votes out of its summary analytics by default. Annika's log ran to 412 pages. By the end of the 3rd year, she had identified 31 delegations that voted present on every resolution involving the THR of Unnearich, regardless of the resolution's content. By the end of the 5th year, she had cross-referenced their resource dependencies and found that 26 of the 31 sorts between 40 and 80% of their interstellar logistics support through THR of Unni patron state contracts. By the end of the 7th year, she had met personally, in locations the Council's diplomatic calendar did not record, with representatives from 22 of those delegations. By the end of the 9th, 18 had signed a document that did not exist in any official registry. She kept the log on a secondary screen at all times. In every session, in every chamber, she had never explained what it was to anyone who asked. When junior staff noticed it, she told them it was an old formatting project she had never finished. They believed her, because the log looked like a spreadsheet, and nobody finished old spreadsheets. Quo Ari Radiate Mill had served on the Stellar Council for 84 years. In that time, the Quo Ari Continuance had voted against 8 neutrality resolutions involving conquest actions by patron state powers. They had prevailed in none of them. The Quo Ari did not have the voting weight to prevail alone. What they had was the institutional memory of 8 failures, and a species-level habit of keeping records with the same thoroughness that other species kept weapons. He found Annika in the corridor outside the chamber 40 minutes after adjournment. The corridor had emptied quickly. Delegations that vote with the majority do not linger. Delegations that vote against it tend to move with purpose, because lingering is interpreted as either grief or provocation, and neither is useful. Cole Th Mill moved with neither. He moved like someone who had somewhere specific to be and had already calculated the most direct route. "You are not the first," he said. His voice carried the quality that 84 years of institutional presence produces in certain species, not loudness, but the certainty of being heard regardless of volume. Annika was still holding her cup. "I know. The MEV Hari delegation voted against the K-Earth neutrality resolution in session 407th. The result was 68-6. They filed a protest. It was acknowledged and archived. Their colonies were absorbed within 14 months. He paused. Not for effect. Cole Ari pauses carried information the same way his words did. The pause said, This is a data point. Receive it as such." The Set His Borderlands coalition voted against session 819th, 63-9. Their filing is still listed as pending review. How long ago was session 819? 31 years. Annika nodded once. The corridor was quiet enough that the environmental system's residual hum was audible. The vent correction she had entered earlier, taking effect. She had set the chamber temperature from 2 degrees warm to nominal. It had taken 11 seconds. She watched Cole Th Mill's face, and he watched hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment that was not uncomfortable. "You voted against," she said. "We vote against every time." He reached into the fold of his outer garment and produced a data chip, which he placed on the ledge beside her. The THR of UNI patron list. Every species with a signed resource dependency contract. Current as of this session. I have been maintaining it for 19 years in the event it became useful to someone who was not planning to file a protest. Annika picked it up. She did not look at it. She already knew its contents down to the third decimal of each contract value. Because one of the things SciFi had spent 9 years doing was building a cartographic model of THR of UNI economic dependency chains. And Cole Th Mill's list was one of 6 sources she had used to construct it. "What?" Annika asked. Cole Th Mill looked at her with the expression his species produced when a question arrived that they had answered before and expected to answer again. "Because," he said, "the alternative is watching and doing nothing. And I have already spent 84 years establishing that I am not good at that." He left. His footsteps on the corridor floor made the particular sound of deliberate, unhurried movement, not slow, only measured, as though speed were a resource he had learned not to waste. Annika looked at the data chip in her palm. Then she looked at the cup in her other hand, at the coffee cooling inside it, at the faint ring the heat had left on the ceramic rim. She put the chip in her jacket pocket and walked toward the transit hub. SciFi worked out of a rented office in a commercial district on a station 3 relay jumps from the Stellar Council's primary hub. The office had no official designation in any diplomatic registry. Its lease was held by a trading logistics firm that processed agricultural commodity contracts for minor species grain suppliers. The trading firm was real. Its contracts were real. Its revenue, modest as it was genuine. She played Mancala against an AI opponent every morning before work. Not for recreation, though she found it restful. She played because the game required you to count resources in multiple simultaneous chains while tracking your opponent's likely moves 4 or 5 steps ahead, and she had found, over 9 years, that it kept a particular part of her mind sharp the diplomatic cartography required. She was 40 years old. She had grown up in Bujumbura. She had a precise habit of measuring the distance between things, not metaphorically, literally. The spatial relationship between nodes on a network map, and she had spent 9 years measuring the distance between every minor species delegation and the point at which THR of UNI economic pressure would become THR of UNI political control. 18 of those delegations had crossed the threshold from manageable dependency to structural capture. 18 had signed the document. When Annika's signal came through, not a message, only the environmental ping. The temperature correction timestamp from the chamber's intake sensor network. 17 simultaneous acknowledgement returns from minor species terminals logged across 3 relay stations in a pattern that looked, to anyone reviewing it without context, like routine sensor calibration noisy. She closed the Mancala board, opened her working map, and sent a single-character acknowledgement. Then she called Matteo. Pachoquis had been embedded among HFY technocrats for 7 years. He was 36 years old and had grown up in La Paz, at an altitude where the air carried a thinness that, he had once told Ishe, you either learn it to work inside of or it taught you something about your own limits. He had learned it to work inside of it. He had learned it to work inside most things. His cover identity was that of a logistics process consultant, specializing in supply chain integration for interstellar commodity distribution. The identity was not false. He was, genuinely, an expert in supply chain integration. He had spent 7 years becoming one, because the best way to understand a supply chain's vulnerabilities is to spend years improving it. And the people whose supply chain you are improving tend to trust you with more information than they intend to. He had a hobby. On rest cycle evenings, in the narrow quarters of the HFY administrative complex where he was stationed, he wove textiles, altitude weaving, a Bolivian tradition adapted for zero-gravity conditions, which required you to anchor the loom frame to the wall and work the threads in a way that accounted for the absence of downward tension. He had a finished piece folded at the bottom of his personal effects container. He had started it on his first week aboard. He had not finished it. He answered Ishi's call on the second ping. It went through, she said. 71-4, he said. He had watched the session feed. Yes. A pause that was not a question. Hild? Hild is still in detention. The terms haven't changed. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Through the narrow viewport of his quarters, the HFY administrative complex's exterior lighting array cast long geometric shadows across the docking infrastructure. He had looked at that view for 7 years. He had a precise understanding of which docking bays handled which categories of supply shipment, which ones would be empty in 36 hours when the resource withdrawal notifications began arriving, which ones would stay empty. Then we start, he said. We started 9 years ago. Aye, she said. This is just the part that makes a sound? Hildrash had been in HFY detention for 5 years. She was 43 years old and came from Wurzburg. She had been detained on a charge of treaty interference, which was the HFY reach's legal designation for the act of communicating with member species of a patron dependency network without filing a formal diplomatic disclosure. She had communicated with 14 such species over the course of 18 months. She had been caught on the 15th. The HFY detention facility was not, by the standards of its formal documentation, inhumane. The cell was a reasonable size. The environmental systems functioned. The nutrition provision met galactic baseline standards. She had received 12 plea offers across 5 years. Each offer had asked for the same thing: the names of her contacts. Each offer had included a progressively more significant reduction in her sentence in exchange. The final offer, received 8 months ago, had included full release, retroactive diplomatic immunity, and a resettlement provision. She had declined. On her cell wall, she kept a paper calendar. She crossed off days, not to count down to release. She had no release date, because she had declined all 12 offers. And the HFY detention systems policy for undisclosed sentence prisoners was indefinite holding pending cooperation. She crossed off days because her father had told her once, when she was 11 years old and spending a week indoors with a fever, that a day marked is a day that existed. Unmarked days became nothing. Marked days became something you had lived through. She had 826 marks on the wall. The day the supply chain withdrawal notifications began arriving at administrative terminals, she crossed off Mark 827 without knowing why it felt different. VL Haridas received the first notification at 340 in the station's administrative cycle, 6 hours after filing the session summary. The VET-HR Grain Compact had suspended its resource subsidy contract with the HFY reach's third patron state, citing a procedural review clause in the contract's annex that allowed for a 60-day suspension pending resolution of an unspecified compliance dispute. The notification had arrived through standard commercial channels. VL Haridas read it twice, noted it, and flagged it for the Economic Affairs Division. The second notification arrived 11 minutes later. The Durath Mineral Consortium. Same clause, different patron state, different commodity category. The third arrived at 404, the fourth at 412, before the administrative cycle reached its midpoint. Saul Haridas had received notifications from 7 distinct minor species economic entities, across for commodity categories, referencing for different patron states in the HFY dependency network. Each notification cited the same procedural review clause. Each clause was, upon examination, entirely valid. Each contract had contained it for between 3 and 9 years. Saul Haridas touched the edge of the terminal frame before opening the Economic Affairs summary file. They habit. The frame's edge was smooth, slightly cooler than the ambient temperature of the room, and the gesture took less than a second. It was the way one began formal documentation hand to frame. Then file. The carapace plates along the upper thorax shifted twice as the summary loaded. 18, not 7, not 12. 18 separate economic entities had filed suspension notices within a 6-hour window. Across every major commodity category in the HFY patron state supply matrix. Simultaneously, the carapace plates shifted again and locked. Saul Haridas read the count 3 times, then opened a second window and pulled the session summary filed 6 hours earlier. Scrolled to the behavioral assessment section. Stillness consistent with capitulation behavior. Read it again. Reached for the frame edge. Stopped. The hand held in the air for a moment, not touching anything. In the Stellar Council chamber, the vote had passed before Annika Rasmus unfinished her coffee. She had been watching the surface of the liquid when the presiding officer announced the result. Not because she was grieving, and not because she had stopped caring, and not because the weight of 71-4 had pushed her somewhere past the reach of normal reaction. She had been watching the surface because the chamber was 2 degrees warm, and the coffee was cooling faster than it should have, and there was something in the particular geometry of a cooling liquid, the way the surface tension holds until it doesn't, the way the heat dissipates from the edges inward, that she had always found clarifying. She had typed the correction code before the session. The vents had adjusted. The temperature was dropping toward nominal. 11 seconds. 18 systems. The HFY Reaches Fleet Logistics Command received its formal briefing on the supply chain situation at 900 in the administrative cycle, roughly 18 hours after the first withdrawal notification. Admiral Saul Concord had commanded the Saul Plateau annexation fleet for 11 months, through the preparation phase, the staging phase, and now what was supposed to be the execution phase. He was a precise individual who kept his briefing rooms cold and his reports short. He did not like surprises in logistics. Logistics, in his experience, was the category of military planning that contained no surprises by design, because you controlled the variables yourself. He read the supply chain report 3 times. The number 18 appeared in it repeatedly, in different contexts, all of them bad. "This is a coordination failure in our procurement networks," said the logistics officer presenting the briefing. Her carapace plates were very still, which meant she had already decided something and was waiting to be given permission to say it. "The timing is anomalous. Simultaneous filings across 18 separate entities would require advanced preparation." How much advanced preparation? She looked at the secondary screen she had brought into the briefing room. The contract clauses invoked have been in place for between 3 and 9 years. If the clauses were planted deliberately, the preparation timeline would correspond to the earlier date. Saul Concord looked at the briefing document, then at the logistics officer. His carapace did not shift. It was already locked. "Pull the Stellar Council session feed," he said. Yesterday, the full session. In Mateo Quiss's quarters aboard the HFY administrative complex, the textile loom was still anchored to the wall. He had not taken it down. The woven piece was still in the personal effects container, unfinished. He had started it on his first week aboard and had not finished it in 7 years. And he had kept it that way deliberately, because an unfinished thing on a wall meant you intended to return to it. A man who intends to return is a man who has not made a decision yet. He had found, across 7 years, that people extend more trust to someone who has not yet made up their mind. He sent his final status report to Ishii at 7:30, 3 hours before the fleet logistics briefing. The report read supply chain withdrawal confirmed across all 18 nodes. Phase 2 timeline holding. No compromise indicators. Recommend proceeding to phase 3 on schedule. He took the textile piece out of the effects container, folded it once more, and placed it on the top of the container instead of inside it. Then he filed a request with the Administrative Complex's Transit Coordination Office for the next available departure slot. Phase 2 had a name inside the operational framework that Annika and she had built, but the name was a number, not a word, because names are memorable and numbers blur inside the categories of things people do not examine closely. What Phase 2 meant, in practice, was this 18 minor species economic entities had just demonstrated to the THR of UNNI patron state network that the resource dependencies running through it were not stable. They had not made threats. They had not issued ultimatums. They had invoked valid contractual clauses in a way that was, individually, unremarkable and, collectively, devastating, because a supply chain that loses 18 nodes across for commodity categories inside 6 hours does not recover in 6 hours. It recovers in weeks, if it recovers at all, and in the weeks, it does not recover. A fleet that was staging for an annexation operation cannot complete its fuel resupply cycle, cannot move its forward logistics platforms into position, and cannot execute a credible timeline against a target that is watching it fail to move. The Saul Plateau colonies were watching. The 47 vessels of the Shadow Coalition's assembled deterrent fleet were watching from 3 relay jumps away. Engines on standby, carrying no weapons that qualified as offensive under galactic convention, because Annika had read the THR of UNNI Reach's legal definitions of offensive capability with the same precision. She had mapped their supply chains, and the Shadow fleet had been built to specifications that satisfied every definition and violated none. The Shadow fleet had not moved yet. It did not need to. The HFY, Mancala board was packed. Her working map was open across 3 screens in the station office, and the nodes were changing in real time as the withdrawal confirmations came in. She had built the map over 9 years, and she had always known, intellectually, that it would look like this when it activated the cascade of connected dependencies registering the withdrawal in sequence. Each node's change registering changes in the nodes adjacent to it. The whole network rebalancing around the gaps. Intellectually, looking at it was different. She had a cup of tea beside the screens. She had not touched it. She was counting. 17 confirmed. 18 confirmed. She exhaled. Then she opened the communication channel to the Shadow Fleet's coordination vessel and sent towards Phase 3. Vox watched the Shadow Fleet emergence on the THR of Unnicum and network sensor feed at 1340. Not a weapons deployment. Not an attack formation. The 47 vessels had dropped out of standby mode at a distance of exactly 3 relay jumps from the nearest THR of UNNI staging platform, at a position that was, technically, neutral space, and had transmitted a single communication to the THR of UNNI Fleet Command, to the Stellar Council's Emergency Communications Channel, and to the open broadcast network that all registered galactic entities monitored. The communication was not a threat. It contained no ultimatum language. It was a notification of the Shadow Coalition's existence, its membership, its legal registration under the Galactic Compact's Minority Alliance framework, and the terms under which it was prepared to facilitate a ceasefire discussion. The terms were the THR of UNNI Reach would suspend the Saul Plateau annexation operation, effective immediately. All parties would convene within 30 days to draft a new governance framework. The framework would include military protection clauses for non-patron aligned species. The framework would include voting parity provisions for minor species blocks. The communication was signed by 18 delegations. The signatory list was formatted in standard diplomatic notation, with each species' formal name, registration number, and authorized representative listed in alphabetical order by the Galactic Compact's filing system. At the top of the list, before the alphabetical ordering began, was a single line in a different formatting style. It read, "This coalition was registered under Compact Framework 7.42 in the 41st month of Standard Year 847th. Registration was filed by Earth Coordinated Office Delegate Annika Rasmussen. Duration of preparation 9 years, 2 months, 17 days. Vail Haridas read the date. Opened a third window. Cross-referenced the preparation start date against the THR of UNNI Reach's first formal filing of the Saul Plateau annexation intent. The Earth Coordinated Office's coalition registration predated the annexation filing by 4 months. The carapace plates along the thorax locked completely and did not shift again for a very long time. Destiel Haridas reached for the terminal frame, stopped, looked at the hand, pulled it back, pressed the authorization key to file the status update to Fleet Command without touching the frame. In the session summary window still open from 18 hours ago, the behavioral assessment lines at unchanged stillness consistent with capitulation behavior. Resistance probability low to negligible. SO Virath Ken reviewed the Shadow Fleet communication at 13:55 and suspended the annexation timeline at 14:02. He did not do this because the Shadow Fleet outgunned him. The 47 vessels did not, individually or collectively, represent a weapons capability that overmatched the annexation fleet. He suspended the timeline because the supply chain situation meant he could not execute on schedule, and an annexation operation executed off schedule against a target that had just demonstrated 9 years of advanced preparation was not an operation he was willing to put his name on. He filed the suspension with a notation that read operational timeline, paused pending logistics resolution and diplomatic review. Recommend full strategic reassessment. In a conference room in the THR Vunni reaches diplomatic administration. Tix El Haridas was already preparing for the first session of what would become, 27 days later, the Saul Concord negotiations. The preparation notes for that first session included, in a section titled Human Delegation Assessment Update, a single line that had been added after the session summary and never revised. We assumed their patience in council was weakness. Recommend full review of human behavioral assessment protocols. Quo Lari Ray Th Mill attended the Saul Concord negotiations as an observer. He did not have a formal seat at the table. The Quo Lari continuance had not been a member of the Shadow Coalition. Annika had not asked them to join it, because the coalition's operational security had required that its membership remain outside the Stellar Council's direct awareness. And Quo Ari Ray Th Mill's institutional presence inside the council made him both the most useful observer she had and the most dangerous person to include. He sat in the second row of the observer section, behind the delegations, and he watched. On the third day of negotiations, during a recess, he found Annika at the refreshment station at the back of the conference hall. She was holding a cup of coffee. He did not ask whether it was the same cup. He already knew, because he had been watching carefully for years, and he recognized objects that traveled with people. The military protection clause, he said, binding, she said, on all member states. The voting parity provision, proportional representation by population and economic contribution. The calculation method took for drafts. He was quiet for a moment, in the way the Quo Ari went quiet when they were checking a new data point against a very long record of prior data points. In session 407, the MEV Hari delegation asked for both of those provisions. They were told the council structure did not accommodate them. The Saul Concord structure will. He looked at the cup in her hand, then at the negotiating table, visible through the open conference room doors. A long table, very plain, the kind of furniture that institutional spaces accumulate without intention. You built this before the vote. I built it because of votes like the vote, Annika said. There have been a lot of votes like the vote. Quo Ari Ray Th Mill looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned across the preceding months to recognize as his version of something close to approval, very still, very level, not offering more than it contained. You are not the first species to be failed by that chamber, he said. You are the first to have prepared the replacement before the failure. Annika tapped the rim of her cup once, not a signal this time, just a small motion, the kind of thing hands do when the rest of a person is very still. Someone had to, she said. The Saul Concord was signed on the 19th day of the negotiations. Hildrash was released from THR Vunni detention the same morning, under a provision in the Concord's transitional framework that required the release of all individuals detained under the treaty interference statute, retroactively reclassified as protected diplomatic activity. She was brought to the signing chamber by a transit escort and arrived 40 minutes before the ceremony began. She was wearing the same jacket she had been detained in 5 years earlier, because the THR Vunni detention facility's inventory system had returned her personal effects in a sealed container that morning, and she had put on the jacket before opening anything else. The chamber was full. She stood at the back of the observer section and watched the delegations take their seats. The HFY administrative official approached her and asked whether she would like a copy of the Concord document. Standard procedure for observers. I already know what it says, she said. The official noted her name for the distribution list and moved on. Hildrash did not move. She watched the delegation settle. She watched the chair of the drafting committee arrange the signing copies in order. She watched Annika Rasmussen enter the chamber from the side door and take her seat. And she watched Annika set a cup on the table in front of her. And she did not say anything. Because there was nothing to say that the room was not already saying, more clearly than words could. 5 years, 12 offers, 1826 marks on a paper calendar. She watched the first signature go down. Annika tapped the rim of her coffee cup once, and 18 systems moved. The breathing room lasted for seconds. Then the signing chamber filled with the sound of documents being arranged, chairs adjusting, the particular ambient noise of an institutional moment resolving into record. The Stellar Council convened an emergency session 9 days after the Saul Concord signing. The session was called to address the formal withdrawal of 6 founding member delegations from the Council's governance framework. 3 of those delegations cited the neutrality vote. 2 cited the Council's structural failure to accommodate minor species representation. 1, the Quolari Continuance submitted a withdrawal document that contained, in its preamble, a complete record of every resolution the Council had failed to enforce against patron state conquest actions over the preceding 80 years. The document was 340 pages. Fui L. Haridas attended the emergency session as a THR observer, no longer a full delegate. The THR reaches Council membership was under formal review as part of the Saul Concord's transitional provisions. The presiding officer called the session to order and noted that a quorum was present, though only just, no one was watching their coffee. The Saul Concord's preamble listed, in its opening paragraph, 3 categories of persons whose work had made the Concord possible: the diplomatic architects, the technical contributors, and, in a 3rd category with no formal institutional title, those who had maintained operational security at personal cost. Hildrash's name appeared in that 3rd category. The THR translation software rendered the category heading as Human Obstacle Category. Retired, which was a translation error that no one corrected, because the Concord's translation protocols were still being standardized, and also because several people who read it found it accurate in ways the software had not intended. Annika Rasmussen stood at the viewport in what had been the Earth Coordinated Offices chamber in the Stellar Council complex, a room that the Council's Facilities Division had already begun processing for reassignment. The plaza below was beginning to fill. Delegations arriving for the session, observers, a small cluster of minor species representatives whose presence here, in this building, on this morning, had not been a given thing 3 weeks ago. The coffee cup was on the windowsill, empty. She had not refilled it since the Concord signing. Below, 2 members of the Quolari delegation crossed the plaza at that particular deliberate pace that 80 years of institutional presence produces, not slow, only measured, as though speed were a resource not to be wasted. One of them looked up at the viewport. Annika could not tell, at this distance, whether they saw her. She did not move away. The cup sat on the sill. The plaza filled. Somewhere in the building's environmental system, the vents ran at the corrected temperature. Nominal, steady. The way they had been running since the morning she typed the 4-character code and tabbed the next record and waited for a vote she had already survived.